Hello guys and welcome back to the 5th episode of my series about Italian presidents, where I don't just talk about the president of the Republic of Italy but also whatever was happening in Italy at the time. Last time we talked about Antonio Segni, the president from Sardinia that helped Italy reforming its agricultural sector, then got a stroke and resigned. Today we're talking about Giuseppe Saragat, the first social democrat in the Quirinale. This video will be a bit different, as you guys might have already realized that the previous episodes have been very right-wing centric so far. The choice has been deliberate, but not for a matter of opinions. Reality is that throughout most of its history, Italy was under the influence of Democrazia Cristiana, and as most pro-US parties during the Cold War, they did their absolute best to keep the communists and the socialists outside their cabinets and a safe distance away from power. But today, for the first half of the video at least, we will look back at some events through the lenses of the left, and we're going to go over the history of the Socialist Party. Let's start. Giuseppe Saragat was born in 1898 in Turin. His mom was Sardinian and his dad from Piedmont. He fought in the First World War and graduated in economics shortly after. His first years after graduation were spent working in the Italian National Bank, which was great, and joined the Socialist Party called Partito Socialista Unitario, whose secretary was Giacomo Matteotti. If you weren't familiar with Matteotti, he was the guy that essentially led the parliamentary opposition to Mussolini in the early 20s and was killed by some of his grunts in June 1924. Saragat would be forced to go into exile in 1926, first to Vienna, then Paris, where he met other great socialists of his time like Otto Bauer, Friedrich Adler, and Leon Blum. Over the years, he would be able to formulate a concrete presentation of his political ideas. He wanted to incorporate liberal ideas in socialism, something that would eventually be summarized in the term social democrat. Saragat is one of the main founders of social democracy. Today, social democracy is kind of the norm. Most countries have a party that follows the ideology, but at the time it was considered an odd idea to say the least, something wacky like anarcho-monarchism or whatever the fuck this is. When it came to the Italian socialist diaspora, Pietro Nenni and Saragat were the most influential members and the informal leaders. They were also friendly rivals among themselves. In 1934, they decided to make an alliance with the communist diaspora, something that would play a huge role a few years from then. In July 1943, with the fall of fascism closing in, Saragat thought it would be a great idea to go back to Italy, though he got captured and imprisoned for a few days, until his friend Bruno Buozzi came in and saved him with his rebel socialist army. Sadly, he would be executed shortly after. Poor dude. In August 23rd, the new Socialist Party, under Saragat and Nenni, would be founded and called Partito Socialista Italiano di Unità Proletaria. As you can imagine, the Italian Communist Party was also remade and the alliance kept standing. Even though Mussolini was already out of the picture by the 13th of September, Saragat was somehow recaptured by the fascist police, together with Sandro Pertini, another very important character in the Socialist Party. Well, Pertini was actually captured many years before, but they were cellmates, and they stayed at the Regina Coeli jail. He was able to escape weeks later thanks to some of his party members. After that, he would be able to escape to the Vatican together with Nenni, where he met De Gasperi, who was also hiding there as a librarian in the Vatican's Central Library. What are the odds? In 1945, with the fascists completely out of the picture, Saragat was nominated Italian ambassador to Paris. It would be a relatively hostile environment, since Italy was still perceived as the enemy by the French, but he was able to get along fine with French diplomats for a while until he decided to go back after the rest of his party requested it. The time between 1946 and 1947 was chaotic, to say the least. The Cold War was about to begin. Socialists and communists were starting to feel further and further apart. Togliatti wanted the two parties to unite in some big proletariat movement, but Nenni and Saragat didn't want that. This was because Togliatti had strong ties to Stalin. Due to Saragat's diplomatic experience, he foresaw to an extent the difficult times ahead. Unlike his friend Nenni, that won't be enough to keep the socialists in power, at least not all in one piece. At the first election of 1946, the socialists had a big lead over the communists and Saragat became president of the Constituent. He also went to France with De Gasperi and Bonomi to improve French and Italian relations. Historian Giuseppe Saragat once pointed out that the Socialist Party was a federation of personalities more than a melting pot of ideas. People like Nenni, Pertini and Saragat were great speakers, and Saragat especially was incredibly well educated and knowledgeable in the fields of literature, philosophy, politics and economics. However, the party lacked the unity to achieve much. Saragat himself was not particularly inspiring. He flew high but couldn't lead. He was an idealist, not a leader. So he was eventually isolated in his party until in January 1947 when he left and made the first Social Democratic Party. After the schism, Nenni and Saragat both resigned, and so De Gasperi made his third cabinet, again with the Communists and the Socialists, though this time excluding Saragat's newly formed party. Saragat and his Social Democrats will have another chance into power in De Gasperi's fourth cabinet, without the other left-wingers. Saragat will be vice prime minister, and he was not the only one to be added to the cabinet. Roberto Tremoloni will be placed in the Ministry of Industry and Ludovico d'Aragona in the Post Ministry. When the elections of 1948 came around, the Social Democrats were being criticized by the Communists and Socialists alike. However, they still got a solid 7%. The Socialists, on the other hand, lost many seats. What was most surprising for the Social Democrats was the foreign attention and support they got, especially from the Americans, which would also be in the form of monetary loans. Though in the years between 48 and 53, the party went a bit into a decline. It was too heterogeneous, and Saragat wasn't that great of a leader. Saragat became so unpopular that he was dethroned from his own party's leadership by a certain Ugo Guido Mondolfo. Only in June 1953 he will be able to regain his party after he took advantage of the divisions caused by the North Atlantic Treaty. Mondolfo was a neutralist because he was against war. This put him in disagreement with the majority of the party, and so Saragat came back to lead it. The division had a huge toll on the Social Democrats, however, since they would lose quite a lot of votes in the following election, going from 7% to 4.5%. Besides this drop, the Social Democrats stayed into power alongside the DC for quite a long time. If you remember, the Christian Democrats were slowly moving more and more to the left, thanks to Fanfani and Moro, and since the Social Democrats were more moderate and good partners with the Americans, this made them the perfect allies. Nenni started to see the Social Democrats as a bridge to get into government, and therefore from 1956 onwards, the two socialist parties would slowly improve relations once again. This also played a role in the cooperation between the DC and the Socialists, which, as you know, led to the formation of Moro's cabinets made out of Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, Socialists and Republicans. This brings us to 1962, when Saragat decided to finally run for president of the Republic. The years before his nomination were pretty intense. Saragat would spend the years preceding his nomination by trying to convince the West that a united socialist party would be a great asset in taking down the communists. After saying he won the election over him, he felt betrayed by Moro and the rest of the DC who didn't vote for him. On the other hand, Nenni did, further strengthening the bond between the two parties. In August 1963, during Leone's cabinet, Saragat would accuse Felice Ippolito, head of Italy's nuclear program, for mishandling government funds. He was found guilty and removed from office. With Ippolito gone, the Italian nuclear program lacked leadership and was absorbed by Eni that didn't care much about nuclear programs, and so it was put aside. Some have speculated that Saragat had actually done this to sabotage the nuclear program in favor of carbon fossil industries, but again, it is speculation. In December 1963, Moro succeeded Leone, and Saragat was put into the foreign ministry, allowing him to make even stronger bonds with the Americans. To push further the theory that Saragat was under pressure by the American oil industry was that as soon as he became president, he pardoned Ippolito, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. It must have been an awkward encounter. The presidential elections started in December 1964. The main candidates at the start were Fanfani, Leone, Saragat, and a certain communist called Terracini. Things eventually came down to Saragat Saragat and Leone after the communists joined Saragat and Fanfani was bullied to the point of quitting the election by the Socialists. Saragat won the votes of the left and got a solid 67%. Essentially, the only people that voted against him were the ultra-right-wingers such as the MSI and the monarchists. In his inauguration speech, Saragat would talk about peace, safety and social matters such as healthcare and schools. One of his principal goals was actually the unification of the Socialist Party. He did partly succeed in that, creating the Unified Socialist Party, which turned out just a 3-year-old experiment from 1966 to 1969, something that just couldn't live on due to the divisions of the Socialists. However, Saragat had plenty of other things that made him stand out in history. He was the first president to face the Years of Lead, which was a time period characterized by terrorist attacks done by radical groups such as Red Brigades and neo-fascist organizations. Other than that, there were a lot of student revolts that had originated from the ones in 1968 that were raging all over the Western world. Saragat would never fully understand what caused these acts of unrest. In the cabinet at the time, between 1968 and 1970, there was a DC leader called Mariano Rumor, who was not very popular and actually pretty forgettable even at the time. In fact, these demonstrations were often caused by their unpopularity. Saragat would always reply to these acts with telegram after telegram, urging people to remember the concepts of responsibility, sacrifices, and hard work. All these went nowhere. Saragat couldn't understand that the origin behind the unrest were social tensions among the lower and middle classes. His ignorance and denial were what eventually led to the period of terror that lasted until the 90s. There were several episodes that led to social and civil unrest in Italy. In 1969, a bomb blew up during Milan's city fair. Aldo Moro was there too. That same year, Nixon came to visit Rome and the communists started protesting on the streets. The protests escalated into violence once the MSI showed up as well. The toughest event to endure for Saragat has to be the Fontana Square massacre. A bomb was placed in a trash can during an anti-fascist parade and several people lost their lives. Saragat could not come to the funeral of the victims of the latter tragedy because of health problems, which would certainly handicap his governance up until the end of his term. Rumor went there instead, and the only reason why he didn't start a state of emergency because he saw so many people at the funeral, and so he actually had the impression that the people were on the side of the state. To this day, actually, it is unclear who was behind the massacre. Some say it was anarchists, others say it was done by the fascists who were inspired by the coup d'etat in Greece that had just happened recently. Another thing that led to a lot of concerns about Saragat was the removal of De Lorenzo, the chief of staff of the Italian army, in 1967. If you guys remember, De Lorenzo was the one in charge of the Italian Secret Service when Segni was in charge, and he had just been accused of trying to make a coup d'etat back in 1964, back when he was at the head of the Carabinieri, something that was very likely untrue. Even Saragat knew that. He even appointed him as head of the army just the year before, but he still removed it. The reason why he did so was because he found the dossiers he had ordered to be made about specific political figures in Italy. There were files about thousands of people, including Saragat himself. Ironically enough, Saragat would have to deal with a real coup d'etat in 1970 by a certain Junio Valerio Borghese, and we're not talking about a competent coup d'etat like the one Borghese was inspired by, the one in Greece or the recent one in Myanmar. No. We're talking about a very pathetic one that did absolutely nothing, to the point that nobody really noticed. I do not have a lot of time to get into this accident, but it was very sad. If you want me to cover it in the future, be sure to comment down below and like the video since you're at it. I guess if we reach 30 likes, I will do it. Saragat's presidency was not all bad though. He traveled a lot, both in Italy and abroad, oftentimes with his daughter. He went to the US, to Canada, to Haiti, to Oceania, and around Europe. In fact, Italy actually had great foreign relations at the time, despite its unpopular government. In 1971, he would appoint his friend Nenni as senator for life, and when his term ended, he came back to lead his his party. He kept the friendship with Nenni, and Pertini would even ask him to be prime minister once in 1979, but nothing came out of it. He would die quietly in 1988. His party would do the same shortly after for falling into the vices of corruption and the lack of leadership. And that was Saragat's presidential term. In his last speech, he took credit for the overall improvement of public healthcare and schools, which was true, but it is obvious that his mark on the social state of the country was mostly negative. Next episode, we will see how the next president, Giovanni Leone, governed the country throughout its hardest time in history. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe for more. Check out the description for Discord and PayPal, and I will see you next time.